But what's really got people upset in the UK is not so much around, the concept of having a digital wallet that could hold credentials. It's the kind of tracking and centralization that goes behind it. What has been labelled really the database state. Some tool to help you. It's actually a kind of like a state that uses information about you, shares information about you, data about you, to do things to you, rather than you kind of ask the state to do something to you. You're kind of almost there to be kind of like the state does these things to you.
Welcome back to Nerding Out with Victor. Today I'm joined by James Baker. Welcome, James.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you for coming on the show. Today, we're going to talk about more around the policy than we usually do. So today is going to be about Online Safety Act and digital ID in the UK. So a bit of a UK-centric episode today. Before we dive into the actual show, James, maybe you can give the viewers a bit of backstory about yourself so we have some more context about the conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I'm someone who's been campaigning on privacy and tech issues in the UK for kind of over 20 years now. Used to work for a campaign called No to ID back in the day, and we helped defeat the ID cards the last time around, and a lot of kind of surveillance pro issues then. Since then, I've had a bit of a spell. I worked in local government for a bit. I was a representative in local government, did a bit of time working for some MEPs in Europe when the UK was still in the European Parliament. And the last few years I've been,
the good old days.
been at the Open Rights Group, kind of campaigning again on tech and digital issues. And I guess Open Rights Group is really like the UK's version of EFF.
Right. So EFF I'm a big fan of, but so I'm glad to have somebody representing those same issues on this side of the pond. Today, we got to dive deep into these issues, and there are a lot to unpack. And I think most people have at least seen this on their radar, both the Digital ID and Online Safety Act. But I want to start off with the Digital ID.
Yeah.
At the face value, this seems like a very sensible thing. Like having an ID in your phone seems like a fairly non-controversial concept, fairly straightforward idea. But there's a lot brewing under the hood here, or behind the scenes. So maybe for those not familiar with the concept and the controversies, I guess, around this, let's start there. Let's start unpacking
why
this is such a big deal.
Why it's a controversial issue, sure. And I think a lot of this stuff, right, the devil is in the detail of how digital ID is done. We are used to an age, aren't we, where we will have an app on our phone, perhaps like a digital wallet app, and that can store credentials, and we can kind of use that. But like with any app on your phone, right, it's kind of who controls the app, what app is, what data is that app collecting, how's it being run, who's in control of how that identity is issued or revoked, who has power over that. I mean, at the essence of it, with anything digital, it's done at the flick of a switch, right? So your credentials exist or they don't exist based on a decision which could be made of a click of your fists, click of your fingers. So you can kind of you can lose access to your identity as well as you can gain it easily. And you see that, I guess, around issues of digital exclusion and people kind of losing it. Whereas you have something physical, there is a sense of it's there, it's in your back pocket. If the tech goes down, if there's a systems failure, you've got that as a kind of hard copy backup. I mean, I am a total tech nerd. I love tech things, but I don't travel without a physical backup of things as well, because stuff does break and stuff does go down. So I guess on one essence, there's as a general sense of is this going to replace other methods that I've known and trusted for a long time and are kind of pretty secure and resilient to failure. So there's that whole aspect of it. But what's really got people upset in the UK is not so much around, the concept of having a digital wallet that could hold credentials. It's the kind of tracking and centralization that goes behind it. What has been labelled really the database state. And you see that really being advocated strongly through organisation Tony Blair Institute. Obviously, Tony Blair, UK's former Prime Minister. He's now been running the Tony Blair Institute, and he's been essentially, I mean, it's a huge organisation, Tony Blair Institute, like employs over 400 people, and they kind of lobby at this international level for this concept of like how AI can work in order to create a kind of AI smart state that delivers public services for you before you even know you do it. So when ID cards, digital ID again got announced, I was like, they're doing tours of like the press circuit on kind of radio, on TV, up against the Tony Blair Institute, and they're not talking about some kind of identity credential issued to a wallet and that's it. They're talking about a kind of radical transformation of how the British state works. So the example they gave was, imagine a lady who's just had a baby. She can now claim child benefits and get access to like what the state offers to help people with children without even having to apply for it. So that whole concept is not, some tool to help you. It's actually a kind of like a state that uses information about you, shares information about you, data about you to do things to you, rather than you kind of ask the state to do something to you. You're kind of almost there to be kind of like the state does these things to you. So that is what has really, I think, alarmed a lot of us who care about these issues around privacy and data, not so much actual digital credential, but that kind of revolution of how the state would work.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to kind of highlight here, for at least for international listeners, is that unlike most, I guess, European and international states, the UK doesn't have any form of ID outside of driver's license, which is, for me as someone who moved to the UK, was kind of a weird one, right? So I think this ties together in some ways, right?
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, like quite a lot of common law countries with that common law tradition, identity is established through your interactions with other people. So you have ways to prove your identity, but they're not officially done centrally by the state. You might have like a birth certificate, or you might have a license that proves you're that person to drive, or you might have a passport that improves your entitlement to travel. But none of these things in and of themselves are proof of your identity. You can also in the UK, I mean, you can like change your name freely when you want to. So at the moment, I'm called James Baker, but I could myself sign a bit of paper tomorrow and call myself like John Barnes, and just change my identity. So we have that kind of freedom to change identity. It isn't something that is, determined by a central authority. But the other thing the UK doesn't have, which a lot of countries that do have this digital ID have, is a written constitution and those strong protections for privacy. So I talk about this with, an example of Germany, for example, where they do have ID cards in Germany, but then they also have very strong, written constitution that protects a lot of their privacy rights, which gives them some future protection about an authoritarian misuse of those ID cards in the future. But in the UK, because we don't have that kind of written constitution, you actually see, the threat for some of these systems, I think, are kind of bigger potentially to the UK than they are, some other countries that already have them.
Yeah. So I'm from Scandinavia, and in Scandinavia, we've been using something called Bank ID for a very long time. I'm sure you're familiar with that product. And that was not controversial by any means when that was rolled out. And it's now essentially your ID to interface with any banking system or any governmental system, which, for good or bad, I actually myself was in a pickle for that, because my bank ID expired and I don't live there, and I could only, I had to go to the physical bank to renew it when I was in Sweden. So that highlights one of the problems faced there. But the thing that kind of worked there was that bank ID was created as a unity between all the banks. So they basically had, because of KYC, they knew their customers, so therefore they could issue bank ID, which is slightly different than the narrative coming from the UK, right? And the model that the bank ID, the model that the digital ID has been modeled around, I don't think it's coming from that model, but rather from, I think, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but I think from more like the Estonian side of how the Estonian e-citizenship works, for instance. Is that correct, or where are the inspiration drawn from this?
It's been talked about. I mean, politicians have referenced Estonia quite a lot for this. Yeah, I think their idea is something that government centrally creates, and then is going to be a kind of government wallet, which they then issue credentials to. I mean, the only slight bit of good news I've heard coming out about this is that they're talking about using the W3C standards for digital identity wallets and digital credentials, which if you apply those properly, and again, like the devil is in the detail, but if you did apply those standards correctly, you could create a fairly privacy friendly way of doing digital ID. So it's really, I think it's going to be like, what happens to the data behind the scenes? Is all the data in government going to be merged into a central authority within government then issues these IDs, or are different government departments and local authorities and maybe even like private sector able to kind of issue their credentials themselves to these schemes? So to give you an example, like here in the UK, if you wanted to become set up a pub, that would be like your local authority would issue your alcohol license rather than central government. So is it going to be a kind of a system that, say, like every separate part of government can issue a digital credential to that wallet, or is it going to be kind of centralized data sharing and that kind of control that goes with it? So that's kind of really where we're at with a lot of the concerns around it. I mean, it's interesting, like, the banking example, like the UK's banking is pretty advanced as a country. Our fintech is kind of up there. We've got a lot of mobile banking applications and things that can kind of do some form of identity. It's very integrated now with like credit reference checks and stuff if you're opening up new accounts for like this is where we're kind of some of the examples the government says, oh, it's such a hassle, you have to get your paper bills out to open up an account. Like, no one does that anymore.
This is true though. This is true though. I am so frustrated with KYC checks for everything, because I feel like multiple times a year between bank accounts you have to like, oh, now you have to do your KYC, scan your council tax bill, set it in, and it's just like, guys, this is not it should be a solved problem by now in a modern country.
Yeah, there is that repetition. I had it with one of my accounts. I hadn't done it, and then a payment went through, and it's like, oh no, we've not been able to like process this subscription payment because you haven't done your like updated check. And there is that kind of element of control with some of that as well. And you see it, like it's increasingly difficult to use cryptocurrencies, for example, in the UK, because they keep trying to like constantly, tell us your data, tell us what you're wanting to use this cryptocurrency for, and they're just kind of increasingly making it, I guess, like increase of financial surveillance.
Yes, I mean, but you mentioned devil's in the detail, which I completely agree with, right? I mean, when companies like Palantir have been surfaced as being part of these projects, that ought to make people nervous. My litmus test, if Palantir's involved, something is sketchy is happening. That's my litmus test, generally speaking, right? But where's your head around with regards to that?
Well, I mean, I think, you can go online. I say that there's videos on YouTube or what have you of like Tony Blair speaking with Larry Ellison of Oracle about like this future of digital ID and where AI and this tech can go, and that really tells you what their vision is, or what some people's vision is with digital ID. So I think, the big tech company involved, the company itself could be problematic, but it's about what the laws and what they're going to do with that. And where they see government going with AI and technology. Really, is it going to be like a future where we as an individual kind of have some ownership of digital ID? I mean, you could do it, right? You could issue like a system where other people could create the wallet. You wouldn't even necessarily need to be a government-owned wallet. Like, people could issue credentials to it. Private sector could use it as well. Actually, quite kind of decentralized in the way it works, and not kind of centralized control. Or you can see this thing where like you have a really big tech company involved in it, Palantir, Oracle, someone like that, and like your data is being held by them, and it's putting data across government from like health, because we have like a nationalized health service in the UK, so all of that public health data is available quite easy to suck up, and like crime data, health data, like your tax data, your social data, all of that then goes into like a centralized system, which can then be interrogated with an AI, because that's what is changing in recent years, is that ability to interrogate huge data sets is expanding, and with that, I guess, like the risks of kind of control come along with it. So this is like entirely different, right, to something like the open banking system, which is run by the banks, or not necessarily just the government, or like Germany's ID card, which is like a card and has these strong protections around merging like the large data sets in Germany. So that's the kind of risk with digital ID in the UK, really, is that kind of database state. And then like the AI state that goes along with that.
Yeah. How do you see, I mean, the obvious one you mentioned already is that it's an app on your phone, right? It's your wallet on your phone that obviously draws the thinking to Apple and Google being able to issue these on your phone, right? You already seen this, like Microsoft Authenticator can do this to some degree already. How do you see, like, is there some kind of like in dialogue or some kind of pushback and them trying to control that side against their governments, and to create some kind of like global ID system, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean the global aspect of it, there's an element of it being part of a global agenda. This isn't like some kind of weird conspiracy thing. You can go on the WS website and they've got like a document around smart cities of the future, digital ID, and it's essentially like encouraging different national governments to kind of go down this route of issuing digital ID for their citizens. And I think it's born out of this kind of sense of it's the future, it's an easier way of doing it. We help to like identify people's credentials. But I do think there's an element of this. It's like there is an element of control, and it's also, I think, quite highly linked into issues of taxation as well. So,
yes,
I always joke, like in the UK, like governments have wanted to know more about people since William the Conqueror like invaded and created this doomsday book of every Saxon's farm and how many sheep they had and how many chickens and cows they had and how much land in order to tax them. And so you see with digital ID in the UK, it being proposed like notionally alongside this idea that people are perhaps working illegally, and if they're working illegally, kind of not paying tax. So there's this attempt to tackle the grey market of people working outside of what the government knows about. But at the same time, alongside that, you see AI tools being developed to help like catch people who aren't paying the right amount of tax. So our tax authority, HMRC, has just started scanning people's social media posts to try and detect lifestyle discrepancies between the kind of lifestyle they appear to have on their social media accounts and what they're reporting to government through taxation. So this is kind of like what the concern is that actually AI here is going to be used to essentially police people and stop people doing things that they ought not to.
It's a very, I mean, it's hard to have this conversation without kind of thinking about the social credit system that's being rolled out in part of China, right? Where if you have a central identity and you have a score, and then, well, if your score drops a certain level because you've done something that the government deemed to be bad, you might not be able to leave the country, or you might not be able to use the public transport, or whatever it may be. You may be penalized however they seem fit as per the scheme, right? That I mean, that side of me is terrifying because it goes against so much of our Western values in general.
Yeah, I mean, it is terrifying, I think, and I think people ought to be a bit more terrified. I think it's so scary that sometimes, we like to just not think about it too much or the risk it might happen here. But I mean, already there's kind of AI tools that are used because we do a whole project at Open Rights Group. We call this like pre-crime. So, from that that kind of sense that the technology be used to kind of predict people's likelihood of committing offence as well. But there's already like programs for like perpetrators, so like risk offending tools, which is used in rehabilitation of criminals in the UK, where they'll enter people's data and then they'll predict their likelihood of that they're going to be someone who's going to go and recommit a crime after they get released. And that's used in assessments around whether people should be, released on license from prison or not. So in some ways, like those kind of risk profiling tools exist at this point. There isn't like a centralized credit score that everyone has. Well, there is financially, everyone has a financial credit score in the UK, but there isn't a kind of behavior credit score yet. But there are organizations that use data to create risk profiles of people. So you're not that far away from that then becoming, more centralized, I guess.
Which is terrifying because we all know how much AI today hallucinates, and there have already been cases. I don't have the notes here, but I believe there was at least one reported incorrect arrest in the US where they had used tools like this, where they like predicted somebody, but due to poor training, they arrested the wrong person.
Yeah, and we've had it. So we've had recently UK trials of live facial recognition scanning. So essentially, the police have been given a load of funding from the Home Office, and they go and set up vans outside like tube stations and busy places, and they start using live facial recognition technology to try and identify people who are kind of essentially like wanted by the police, and that has already resulted in like one or two incorrect arrests where the kind of algorithm gets it wrong. And as you kind of scale these systems up, the more people you've got involved in it, the kind of bigger the mistakes will be. And it also, the other problem is it becomes like impossible for the police is like capacity to actually keep up with the amount of data they have. So to give you an example, like the UK has this really widespread ANPR, automatic number plate recognition surveillance system set up all across the country. So if you drive a car and you're in the UK, it will scan your number plate. And I'm not sure, I think it's like one of the biggest databases in Europe at the moment. It has like ridiculous number of entries added to that database every year. You think of all the traffic. But then at the same time, I've got a friend who's like training to be a detective in the police force. He's like, yeah, well, if we're doing a patrol, we get so many pings off the system. We haven't actually got the time to, stop everyone on the system. So you kind of have this sense of like, on the one hand, the UK is like a very high surveillance society, but on the other hand, we're kind of like low enforcement because we've not got like effective court system or effective like police investigation.
Yeah. Between ANPR and London has probably the highest density of surveillance in the Western world, right? And sprinkle digital ID on top of that with all the data sets, like that's pretty terrifying.
Lost you for a little bit there, Victor, on the...
yeah. Are you back now?
You're back now, yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I was just saying, between the amount of cameras available in London with ANPR systems deployed, combine that with digital ID, it's a pretty terrifying idea of, even if it's not done today, but what could be done.
Yeah, what could be done. And then at the same time, if you speak to a lot of British people, they'll tell you about rising fear and concern of crime. And London, I think, although some of the kind of like stabbing and homicide rates are slightly, the spin on that is slightly worse than the actual data is. In terms of like phone theft, that is a real problem in London at the moment. And so we have kind of like in the UK, all of this surveillance, but we don't have the kind of, the low crime that goes with some other cultures, which will also kind of like have authoritarian tendencies. So it's like the surveillance is there, but it doesn't also like help ordinary people struggle with crime, if that makes sense. It hasn't stopped crime. And I think that's the real lesson I'd say, like, it hasn't been the solution to crime in the UK.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And honestly, like, you can see these people with just balaclavas like zooming around town on like scooters and bikes, right? So that's
just
an easy way to mitigate that, right?
Yeah, that's it. You kind of at some point you either need like police patrols on the ground, or you need kind of community intervention to stop people going into crime in the first place. There's like none of that prevention or community funding's all been stripped away. Instead, we've got like loads of cameras everywhere. London's interesting as well because they kind of put up cameras there for like policing like car emissions as well, like low emission zones. And you saw like this real kind of grassroots movement of people actually just like coming out and trying to cut down these surveillance cameras and just kind of rebellion against that kind of surveillance, because it was being used to essentially like fine people for a fairly kind of like low level offense rather than actually help people with their day-to-day struggles with crime.
Right. Yeah. So we've talked about digital ID and why it may be a bad idea, and like but let's wrap up that conversation with, where would you like to see this going? Obviously, you're involved with the policy side of things, with the lobbying side of that. Like, how how can we get this done right? Because I think it is not a bad idea, but the devil is in the detail, right? Like, how can we get this right?
Yeah, I think you have to start with like your legal protections and your legal that you have there for privacy. So what I'd say, like the UK is like, well, we don't have a written constitution. We have the Human Rights Act, which is just a piece of statute passed by Parliament. But one problem, because we don't have a written constitution, you only require like a parliamentary majority to change anything that's there already. It's not like some countries where you have to have some kind of like super majority to change the constitution. So we have a kind of broken democracy problem in the UK. So part of like, if you want digital ID done in a way which like isn't going to be authoritarian or isn't going to strip people of their rights, so you need to have that kind of system of rights in place in the first place. And I think part of the countries that have done that well are countries that have got a very strong constitutional protection for some of these things, and privacy, and courts that will kind of defend it. And within that environment, it's probably safer to think about developing something like a digital ID system. And then I think you also need like polarity and decentralization rather than kind of centralization. So try to create a system which is not all just on like one server, set of servers that could go down, not under one authority's control. Something that like is more decentralized, where the code is open source. We can see how it works. Like different people can choose to operate wallets, be that Apple, the state, even like an NGO or a charity or a bank could maybe kind of operate the wallet software themselves. It doesn't have to just be centralized. And then I think, working to develop those international standards like the W3C standards around decentralized digital identity, and kind of working to make those as privacy friendly as possible, and kind of working on those, I guess, like more the tech solutions around kind of, zero knowledge proofs, and just kind of developing like privacy friendly tech around encryption and how you do that. So I think that's like how I would go about it. I'm always a bit wary of saying like it could be done in a privacy friendly way, because like politicians will take that and then not do it. So I tend to like be more critical. But
yeah, I mean, I think with my little insight on this, like zero knowledge proof seems to be the by far best solution to do this, so that you can actually prove who you are without disclosing information, right? And I think we've seen terrible things that happen when you hand over data to any sort of entity, right?
Yeah, and there are, I mean, I know there's people like within orgs and organization who would like be like critical of zero knowledge proofs, because there are kind of academic papers out there that kind of show in real world applications they're not always possible. And maybe like one example of that is like the recent like Discord breach around.
Yep, I was going to mention that.
Yeah, around like online age assurance stuff. Like even if the age assurance systems secure itself, and even if that was like using zero knowledge proof or whatever, then actually what are your systems around that system? When you start to think of processes which involve like the wider process, it then gets even harder to kind of keep all of that privacy friendly. So I think like the Discord breach wasn't, the actual age assurance provider, but it was through people who then had problems with that and then went onto a different customer service system. Then that customer service system had a breach. So it's a lot harder, even if you get like the privacy right on like one part of our entire system, kind of getting it across your whole process is much more of a challenge.
On the best way to protect data is not to have it at all.
Well, there is that. Like, if you don't need it, don't collect it or use it.
Don't store it. Yeah. Well, that gives us a nice segue over to the second topic for today's conversation, which is the Online Safety Act, which is a highly controversial regulation that went into ratification earlier this year. For those not familiar with it, or maybe those who are, maybe don't have, maybe those familiar with the terminology, but with the name, but not really what it implies. Let's can you give the viewers kind of like a recap of what that is and how it impacts our lives.
Okay, so the very basics of the Online Safety Act is, I guess, and it was an attempt to, or is an attempt to apply to providers of online services. So that's quite broad, anyone doing a website, but any kind of online service where users can interact, place upon them certain legal duties to prevent and mitigate harms. So it comes instead of, the old way of conceptualizing the internet was you're providing a service. What people do on that service is down to them. If they're doing something illegal, it's them who's done something illegal. You're just the facilitator of the space, but the individual liability is kind of, if you publish something. So it's moving from that to kind of trying to put general duties of care and legal responsibility upon service providers. And perhaps the closest analogy I can think of is something like we have health and safety law in the UK, where if you're like providing an activity in the real world, you kind of have a duty of care to people in the real world that it's safe. So it's a bit like trying to apply health and safety law to the entirety of the internet, but with the major problem that like people who run services are based all over the world, whereas the UK is just like one jurisdiction. So it's got that kind of massive problem with its extraterritoriality. And then the other problem with it is just like the complexity of the duties that are placed upon you are kind of mind-boggling, really. And that's where we've kind of run into problems, is that unless you're a really big tech organization with specialists employed working on this, it is pretty incomprehensible for most people to really understand the law and all the codes that have been created. So legislators, they passed the law back in 2023, and then Ofcom had this period of trying to get their heads around it and implement it. And I almost feel a bit sorry for Ofcom, because they've been given a kind of almost impossible task. And then Ofcom has just been spitting out like these 100-page, hundreds and hundreds of pages of codes of practice and guidance that honestly you would like lose the will to live if you had to read through all of this stuff. I kind of think it's like the UK has created like a kind of magnus opus in international bureaucracy with this piece of legislation. I mean, like they did an update of it, right? It was a consultation, 310 pages of consultation, asked like 60 questions. It had 17 annexes. Now that, like, how can anyone seriously? It took me like weeks to go through it, and I'm kind of doing this.
But you've read it. You've read it back
painfully. Yeah, I mean, I got. Thankfully, org employed me to read it. It would not have been something. But yeah, all those donations to org, they're used well. It enables someone who cares about digital rights to get their head around this stuff. But it's. Yeah, so that's the kind of problem with the Act. And then some of the main things that have come out of it are obviously like age assurance, this idea of not just for pornographic websites, but actually for a whole host of other websites, people are having to do now like age checks on their users. That's kind of one of the things that's come out of it. But also with the next round of it, we see increasingly proposals to start deploying perceptual hash matching technologies. Across a whole range of services, including file storage and file sharing. So your Google Drive as well here, and your kind of private documents could be covered by this, to start kind of scanning either content that you produce or content that you're sharing for a whole host of types of content, which is kind of covered by the Act.
There's so much to unpack here, but let's start with the age verification thing, because I think that ties into what we started with digital ID. So there are these conversations very, very tangential, I guess, and very much interdependent, right? But I think it's important to kind of prefix this conversation with the fact that I think there's a lot of like the intents are somewhat good, I guess, but as always, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? I mean, I think it is important to acknowledge that we are living in a problem time where kids are exposed to pornography and like there are a lot of things that are bad, objectively bad, right? The question is not, I don't think anybody, including you and your organization you work for, say that that's not bad. Everybody agrees that that's bad. The question is how we go about to mitigate that and solve that, right? So based on where, like, what's like, if you were to recap your biggest beef with this entire piece of legislation, what would you say that is your biggest issue with it?
Oh, I think my biggest beef, honestly, and I say this as a father, there's nothing in it about educating. There's nothing about educating young people around risks of LC. and there's nothing in it about giving users better technical tools to prevent them seeing the stuff themselves. It's like you're trying to place all the responsibility onto the platform to try and manage content for people, rather than empowering people to, one, be able to like manage the content they see themselves, and two, when they inevitably see content, learn how to deal with that psychologically, like where you can get help, where you can get support, what you might see, the impact of that. And I say that as someone, I grew up in the early days of the internet, the days of like rotten.com, the days when like the large porn sites had total, like when I was younger and you went on to a porn site, there was just all types of content on that site which you just wouldn't see today. It was like far more extreme, and that was kind of like normal stuff. And like rotten.com, it's a group of teenage boys. We all went online and we all just like looked up gore stuff as a group of teenage boys. Haha, isn't this funny? Whereas actually, like, your mates left, and then like the stuff you've seen then replays in your mind later that evening. And actually, I've been exposed to some pretty like horrific content, which has had an emotional impact. But then there's no one to speak to about it. There's no kind of support mechanism within society. So I think that's what we're getting wrong, is that we're trying to rely on platforms to kind of police the internet, when actually it's all of our responsibility as a society. And in trying to police the internet, they're also kind of wrongfully censoring stuff that shouldn't be censored, and they're also kind of causing some of the best bits of the internet to shut down because they can't just like deal with the kind of compliance side of it. So they're actually kind of like forcing people onto big tech platforms.
So that's super interesting, right? I mean, I think the biggest element, the biggest beef I have is kind of like you're pushing it onto the platforms rather than parental responsibilities, for instance. I mean, just to make an analogy, right? If you as a parent show your kids porn, that's a sex offense. But if you are a negligent parent and you let your kids freely browse the internet and the end result is the same, you have not done anything wrong in the eyes of the law. So I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, where the responsibility of the parent, ultimately, who is the person who issues the device to the person who is impacted by this, I mean, where their responsibility lives. I know it's a difficult problem as a nerd myself to enforce this, but I do feel like there should be more onus on parents more so than trying to just turn this around and brush it off and say, hey, big tech companies, you solve this for us.
Yeah, certainly. I think there should be like more of an effort to give parents better tools, and there are tools out there. I mean, it is hard. I'm a dad of a kind of 7-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I can stop like the 7-year-old seeing stuff they probably ought not to, but I struggle to be able to put stuff in place that my 13-year-old couldn't get around if they're really determined to do so. So at that point, it becomes around like talking to them, education, going, look, you're going to see some of this stuff. This is what, how it might impact you. It's okay to talk about it if it does, like not making it a taboo thing. But a lot more could be done in terms of like education and support for parents through like kind of schools as well. I mean, I always had this idea of like, well, why couldn't like the government put some funding into like open source software solutions for like parental control or like filtering technology, and then it could like run a system through libraries, through like education, through the BBC, through radio. You could like tell parents about these tools and help people kind of use them, and it could become like an embedded thing. And in some ways I always thought like that was probably a better solution. A lot of this stuff kind of did happen already though. So already in the UK, if you get out an ISP, by default, parental control blocking will exist at the ISP level. So they will block certain websites at the ISP level, and the ISPs run these kind of block filters, but you have to kind of actively get that taken off. But again, like there's ways you could, if you're a tech nerd, you can go, okay, right, well, I'm gonna like set up my network, and then I'm gonna have like one wireless network which doesn't have a block, so I'm gonna run this other one through like a load of filters, and therefore the children have got this kind of like blocked, safer network, and me as an adult can access a kind of unrestricted one. That's like pretty, it requires a certain level of kind of networking skill in order to kind of set up that network. So I think there's more that could have been done there. You could create products which are like, here's a router, and off the shelf there's like one password you've got which is not got the block list and you can log on to as an adult, and here's like another login that you can give to your children, and you can get their devices logged onto like a Wi-Fi network that has like filters and like parental controls and blocks built into it, which are age appropriate for the age of that child. But you're never going to stop information. I mean, that's the other thing. Like that child will still at some point, they could go out there, they could buy a device off the high street secondhand. They will come across a mate who's got that content on their phone. So, which is why I always think it has to come back to a certain extent to education. I think about like information control. I think like even North Korea, people smuggle memory sticks into North Korea. Like, I just think the idea that you can entirely control information to solve a problem is not feasible. That's why I kind of go back to education a lot of the time.
I think that's very sensible, and I think this ties into the school. Obviously, plays an active role in this. In particular, we've seen kind of a big push towards banning smartphones in schools, and I think that I'm a big proponent of that, right? Because I think that plays into like these things happen all around the clock, right? Not only that, but again, going back to education, I think is important, but also not letting kids have like a smartphone that they can have unlimited access to in their bedroom after hours, right? When they're supposed to be sleeping, right? So I think that's where, again, this comes back to like responsible parenting, but I think it's going to be difficult to sell that narrative to the public because most people don't want to acknowledge that that's the problem.
No, and how do you say to a parent who's like had something horrible happen to their kid because they've been influenced perhaps by a website, something like, well, actually, it's parental responsibility. It's a hard sell, isn't it, to parents, and it's easier to kind of like say it's the government's responsibility, or it's easier, I think, to like wave a stick at big tech and go, oh, it's all these nasty tech billionaires' fault that this stuff is happening, and big tech's a kind of an easy blame target. And you saw, I think, a lot of the debates in UK Parliament, the way MPs were talking about big tech. There's like kind of like vilification is basically, I think there's a loss that actually like there are problems with it, but there are also kind of huge benefits to young people and society generally by having access to this technology. It's not all bad. Like there's this kind of sense. I mean, to give you an example, there's a story that was recently UK press around a teenager who really tragically had like seen some online craze thing around sniffing aerosols, and then they'd overdosed from inhaling aerosol fumes and tragically passed away. I mean, that's just like awful. I can't imagine that as like a father myself. That happened to like one of my kids, would just be devastating. But I also remember growing up in the 90s before the internet, and that kind of thing happened then. They were like, teenagers did these dangerous stunts and crazes, wasn't created by the internet. That was something that went round just schools as kind of memes and ideas. So I think sometimes we've lost a sense of like proportion around risk, and it's now easy, I think, to like blame the medium that it's happened because they saw something on the internet. It must be like the internet and big tech's fault, rather than going, actually, this is a bigger problem around adolescents engaging in risky, stupid behaviors that sometimes end tragically.
It's the easy scapegoat, no doubt. And let's go further. Like we talked about a little bit about potential. We can talk a bit about potential solutions later on, but you talked about something else which I think is important, which is like the case of jurisdiction. And I think Ofcom has been, I guess, been ridiculed, I guess, to say the least, from not the least 4chan, about the fact that they think they are a global authority, whereas in reality, 4chan, whatever you may think of them, is not a part of the UK entity. So I think that's an interesting narrative around like global enforcement, because yes, some people and some entities will play ball, but I think it's naive to assume that the internet will bend over backwards to saying and adhere to what Ofcom suggests they should be adhering to, right?
Yeah. I mean, you really see like a class of speech culture between UK and US, and you go back to the history of this, and I mean, for starters, like America fought a war to get its independence, not to be covered by UK jurisdiction, and out of that, with the Enlightenment, this idea of free speech was like integral to that whole the founding of America, and having that kind of First Amendment right based on those kind of principles of individual liberty and free speech from all of those kind of intellectual speakers, people like Thomas Paine. And now you're kind of seeing a situation where the UK is just trying to impose its model of speech back onto the world, and kind of issuing fines as if they've got the power to enforce those. And they've done that without seeking a treaty, which is how you'd normally kind of enforce laws between countries. You've had a reciprocal agreement for certain crimes and offences that you could be extradited and charged between countries. But because there's that breakdown around speech, you have this kind of bizarre thing where you see like, Donald Trump and Keir Starmer getting questioned about it, and Starmer's going, "Oh no, we're not trying to censor Americans' free speech." And then a couple of weeks later, Ofcom issue a letter to an American company saying we're fining you for your failure to regulate speech on your platform.
Yeah.
And what I don't understand is like why Ofcom didn't go straight to the kind of blocking stage. Surely it'd make more sense. But if they did that, they'd have to kind of admit they don't have the power around the world to enforce this. So it's a bit like the emperor's new clothes. They're trying to like make out they've got this power because it's been written into UK law, but I don't think it's not actually a power that exists. It's not enforceable in the American courts.
Yeah, when I read that Ofcom 4chan narrative, the thing that sprang to mind for me directly was, I'm not sure you remember, but the Pirate Bay used to publish these letters that they have received from US lawyers, and saying, "Oh, in case you didn't know, Sweden is not a state in the US," and now you have kind of like the opposite, right?
Yeah.
In Ofcom try to enforce outside of their own territory. So, I mean, do you see any international kind of consensus? Because I mean, I very much doubt the US would bend over backwards and start enforcing something from Ofcom, right? That completely goes against the First Amendment, right? How do you see that playing out?
Well, there's attempts by people who want this type of regulation by the internet to create an international consensus. So there's organizations, I guess, trying to create similar laws in other countries, and kind of lobby for that. And like Australia, I think, is like another country which is kind of following the UK down this kind of path of like kind of censorship of stuff online, stopping all under 16-year-olds. So I think there will be some consensus between some countries around this stuff, and some companies will comply because they just want to like do business in the UK, and for them it's like, we're not going to pull out of the UK market and lose all that business, so we're just going to do it. And for some of them, it benefits them because it's like, well, actually, we're big enough that we can comply with this, and some of our smaller competitors are going to pull out.
Yeah.
But it's never. I don't think it's the problem is with like the UK. Like the First Amendment is just such a strong protection for speech in America, and also there's such a cultural tradition of it. But and America's such a huge market, but I just don't think they're ever going to get all of that compliance from a lot of the US sites. I mean, what Ofcom can do is then issue a court order to get ISPs to kind of block that, block the IPs and the domains. So, like, what will eventually happen with this, I suspect, is that Ofcom will just issue one of those orders, and 4chan will essentially be blocked off from the UK. And some sites have already voluntarily blocked themselves on the UK to avoid risks of stuff happening. So what will happen is the UK won't have full access to the internet. It will have a UK version of the internet, which is more sensitive than other countries. Not to the extent of China's Great Firewall, but to a lesser extent, we will have a kind of UK Hadrian's firewall, as it's been.
Yeah, that's terrifying. That's terrifying to me for many reasons, but not the least because even if the objective today is to save children, it's a slippery slope, right? The second that is enforced, as it is now is, the scope will always keep expanding. It would never shrink. And that, as with all these surveillance laws and kind of moderation laws, their scope never creeps back. They only expand.
Yeah. And it's like, well, there's a couple of reasons why that happens. One is there's just a lot of people employed in jobs doing this stuff now. And it's like, having succeeded in getting the Online Safety Act, they weren't all like, well, I'm now going to go work on something else. So like, how can I get funding to do the next proposal from people who care about this stuff? So, they kind of carry on in their jobs and roles, kind of trying to push for the next solution. You see that with like VPNs is like the next battleground in the UK. So after the Online Safety Act got implemented, because a lot of people, didn't trust all these age assurance companies with their personal data, and B, just wanted to carry on using the internet as they had before, they went and got VPNs to access content, as people in Russia do, as people in Iran and China do. I think tells you what you want. People in the UK are now in the same boat as people in like China or Russia, in that they need to have a VPN in order to fully access like an uncensored version of the internet.
It's that funny meme I've seen where like of a Russian guy is using a VPN in the UK to access the internet, and the UK guys are using a VPN into Russia to access the internet. It's just that they want different sides of it.
Yeah, pretty much. That is the case. Yeah. It's quite funny. I've not heard that one before. But I had to, just for like Reddit, I didn't want to give my personal details. I hope Reddit don't hear this and like shut down my account. Maybe they don't know what my account is. But I didn't want to give my personal details to Persona, like a US company. Like I didn't want them to have my things. So I was like, okay, I use a VPN. But literally it was like one day I could look at like a subreddit about like alcohol or sexual health advice or like violence, and it would literally just like, if you're in the UK, that would disappear if you hadn't got age verified. You could search for it in your Reddit like search, the subreddit wouldn't even pop up. It didn't even like tell you it was missing because you hadn't been age checked. And then you could go log on, I'm back in like France, Netherlands, I can now access this like these subreddits again. So like that censorship to me was just like awful. As someone who's like grown up loving the internet and the ability to access all these ideas, information around the world, to then feel like I've been cut off from that was, that's the other thing. I've had a lot of friends as well kind of go, well, it's made me pretty depressed, this Online Safety Act. It hasn't improved my mental health or well-being. An act designed to protect people has actually caused a number of people kind of mental anguish, really, through having technology cut off, through like the anxiety of handing over data as well. And I was chatting about this, especially like people with like certain neurodiversity, like perhaps you're autistic and you've been told throughout your life, don't hand over your personal data, and then someone's saying now you have to hand over your personal data. It's like, what should I do? I've been told conflicting things, and it's causing me like stress and anxiety over like, what is the best thing to do? Am I going to be subject to a data breach now? If you're
I want to switch over before we wrap up for today to another thing, which I don't think has been discussed too much, at least in the UK domain. We have seen a lot about this in Europe around chat control, which I put out of scope for this conversation because I think it's enough topic to just cover an entire episode on by itself. But you mentioned already about this creep of scanning messages around image hashes and so forth, which is driven to a great degree by lobbyists that are representing very strong financial incentives. One of them being Thorn, which is co-founded by Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore, for instance. Like, they've been very vocal about lobbying for these things. So not from an altruistic perspective per se, but because there's big financial incentive, despite what the narrative around that might be. But let's unpack that a little bit. What have you seen around that, and what's your head around this hash matching technologies that's part of this?
Yeah, so it came in as part of the Online Safety Act, I think clause 121. It was like stuck in, and thought, well, that's not very exciting. So I kind of coined the term the spy clause for it, and we managed to get some attention at the time around it. We had some great help from Meredith at Signal, really helped to kind of boost the profile of the issue in the UK press. We had like WhatsApp getting involved a bit as well. So we had kind of a bit of help from Meta to kind of raise the profile of it, and we caused like a bit of a political fuss. But I mean, the law still ultimately passed. We won like the smallest concession, but before they could do it, they had to get like an independent person's report on its technical feasibility. But it's kind of there in UK law that Ofcom now have this power. They can issue any provider of a service the requirement to start like developing and deploying kind of like perceptual hash matching of messages to try and detect certain types of content. And they kind of believe, I mean, proponents of believe that you can do that and not break kind of end-to-end encryption, which is this kind of nonsense. So that's kind of where we're at with it in the UK. Really, I mean, I think like the UK is almost like too small alone to try and break end-to-end encrypted messages. I don't think Ofcom are kind of like, I think they realise they can't kind of take that on. So I think proponents of it were like hoping that they'd get the EU and chat controls done at the EU. And then if that were to happen, it'd be a lot harder really to kind of resist it. But what we've got in the meantime is like Ofcom have announced proposals, not for like end-to-end encrypted private messaging, but they're talking now about doing perceptual hash matching for certain file storage systems as well as social media. So that would mean, if you're sharing a Google Drive document and they talk about like certain categories of scanning, such as like CSAM or terrorist content, and then like scanning, even like your Google Drive is getting scanned for that if you were to kind of share it. But the problem is with this stuff is it's like a lot of the time it's not easy to like, it's very contextual whether something is or isn't promoting terrorism or whether you're reporting on it. It's a fine line between a human rights journalist documenting abuses, human rights abuses in Gaza, for example, and depictions of Hamas terrorism. It's not always a clear line. It's not always easy to distinguish. So you get lots of examples where people kind of get content wrongly flagged. So as this kind of rolls out, unfortunately, we're going to see more and more of that. And at the same time, the law in the UK can be expanded by a minister can just add something else as a priority offence. We've already seen like 3 or 4 new priority offences added to the Online Safety Act since July. I think cyber flashing has been added. I think choking porn's now been added, and self-harm's been added. So like when that gets added, it will follow on that perceptual hash matching will try to kick in on social media platforms and others to try and censor that content. So you really see what they've put in place is a kind of censorship regime that can be very easily expanded. And they believe that like at the moment they've just got duties to kind of take this content down, but now Ofcom is saying, we think that like perceptual hash matching technology can be used to kind of automate this and take that stuff down. And so you'll kind of see it being rolled out to social media. And then at some point they've got this like bridge to tackle when it's end-to-end encrypted environments, because it's just not at this point technically feasible to do that, deploy that perceptual hash matching within an end-to-end encrypted environment. So that will be the kind of the future, I guess, battleground and showdown between that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty confident that a company like Meta would bend over backwards for that if they were to be pushed, whereas there are more vocal opponents to it, like Signal being a good example of that, right? Where, well, they've explicitly stated if chat control were to be deployed to Europe, they would pull out, right? Which is a pretty vocal position. I doubt Meta would do something like that because of financial interests.
Probably not. I mean, Will Carfight was pretty good for WhatsApp in terms of saying strongly about its impact on WhatsApp, and then WhatsApp ran this like whole ad campaign in the UK around like the importance of end-to-end encrypted messages. And then they turned on end-to-end encryption for like Facebook Messenger, even though like the UK government hated that. So they've done some stuff which is like not too bad in fairness to Meta. But I think that like that threat of wherever you pull out, I mean Meredith has been very clear that like Signal just like won't do that and break over. Whereas I think Meta's almost said you don't need to worry about end-to-end encryption because we'll give you all the metadata, and actually that's what you want. So
yeah,
you know. But then, I mean, what frustrates me at the other end of the scale, there's so many reports from platforms of content like CSAM that just the police don't have the capacity to follow up. So again, like you could actually make a real difference in stuff if you just had more resources going into the teams that work on it, and you followed up like the leads that platforms were already giving you, and you had a proper criminal justice system of like, you know, like Sweden, saying like Swedish prison system, I think world leader in terms of reforming criminals and reoffending rates and stuff. Like if you tackled that stuff, you could actually address a lot of the harms in perhaps a more constructive manner.
Yeah. And I mean, I had Nick Selby on my last episode. He used to run cybersecurity and cyber investigations at NYPD, and he is a vocal opponent of chat control and kind of resonating what you're saying. Like, these tools are not necessary. There are ways to do this without the massive breach of privacy, right? Because I think, again, this is a line in the sand, right? Like, there must be some privacy. We can't just hand over and assume everything can be backdoored and just must be some sense of privacy in a functioning democracy. Otherwise, we're doomed, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's a real risk to. I say this to like MPs. I say, but you're the sort of people who are going to get blackmailed, or you're going to suffer. You know, if you don't use end-to-end encryption on a secure platform, you're the ones that are going to be like leaking data to China. I mean, there's been a massive scandal in the UK about like Chinese spying, and the amount of like infosec, or the lack of it amongst our establishment in the UK has been shocking. But it's like, you know, you guys should be defending end-to-end encryption because it's in your interest that we're not just opening up data to like Russia or China or you know, criminals who are out there to do like ransomware stuff. You want to be protecting your data, and like as soon as you start backdooring this stuff, you're going to just undermine that security for everyone. I mean, I think it is quite mixed. I mean, within like, you know, cybersecurity professionals and even like former people who've worked for intelligence services. I mean, we've had like former you know, professionals involved in GCHQ in the UK come out against this and kind of say, you know, there's risks here. A lot of their own you know, intelligence services, a lot of their own operatives will rely on different like end-to-end encrypted protocols to, you know, like the CIA will entirely rely on that for all their operatives. So you're going to like undermine systems that help Western like democracies defend their values, you know.
But that's it. You can't have it both ways. No. You either have end-to-end encryption or you don't. And I love, I think it was in chat control in one of the draft. It was so kind of asked her to say like, yeah, we want back-end encryption. We want backdoor everything. We want to backdoor everything, but we want to be excluded, the political class. And it's just like, hold on.
Yeah,
that's not how it works.
You want a special version of the app which hasn't got the backdoor on it.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty terrible. And I mean, this goes to show that it's us. We're excluded, but the rest of them don't need privacy. That's fine.
Yeah, the asymmetry of privacy is a real issue, isn't it? Whether you have to buy privacy or have the power to obtain it.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So as we're wrapping up here, James, I'm curious, how do you see the future of Online Safety Act? Are we doomed? Is there a light in the tunnel? What can we do to kind of like take back control and take back like a more sensible narrative when it comes to this whole spiel domain? Sorry,
I sometimes joke that like the UK government is going to like raise the most like tech savvy generation of any country now, because like every British teenager will be like familiar in how to use Tor, how to use VPNs, how to like how to like find alternative ways. They'll be like kind of thinking up new protocols to like share whatever data mesh nets or what have you. So I think there's always that kind of like opposition creates innovation. You look at like the long view of communication technology. There's been like a pattern of new type of communication comes out, have a burst of freedom. Suddenly governments panic. They want to try and control it. It happened with the printing press. It's happening again now with the internet. So like my long view is optimistic that people will always find ways to communicate and share information freely. And my hope with privacy, I mean, is that we're able to, for thousands of years, people just able to walk into a field and have privacy because they're able to have a kind of private chat, and that was normal. And I think it's like a normal part of human society that we have that ability to have private chat. So again, I remain optimistic that like eventually we will kind of realize this. There's always hope. I don't think you can get like too pessimistic about the dystopian visions of future. I think you need to kind of have some hope and faith in the human spirit.
In the meantime, use VPN and use Signal.
Use Signal, use the VPN, and protect your bits.
Yes. James, this has been a great pleasure. Maybe we'll have you back and nerd out about chat control and various other things, and perhaps a follow-up to this one in terms of the development going forward. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. Much appreciated.
Great. Thanks, Victor. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.
Adios. Bye now.